Let's talk about how to make a clean mix. But real quick, we have a new membership. When you sign up, you get 10 analog masters for free, 2 additional masters per month, and access to the Sage Audio School of Mastering. More on that at the end of the video. Let's start off the mix with some great routing. Before I begin to add any processing, I first want to ensure that I have my routing in order. This is going to make it easier to mix. Now, at this point, I usually say something along the lines of, this is just how I do it or whatnot, but when it comes to organizing and starting a mix session, I genuinely think that this is the best way to go about it, and I really want to stress how much I recommend it. So first, I'll organize similar instruments, and I'll put them together. So all of my guitar tracks are going to go next to each other, all my percussive tracks go next to each other, and so on. Then, I'll color code the tracks and their respective channel strips. I know this seems annoying, but the less I have to think about where a particular track is in the session, the more I can focus on how it sounds. Now, once I have all my instruments grouped and color-coded, I'll change their outputs to buses. For example, all of the drums are going to go on a stereo bus, and all of the guitars will go on another stereo bus, and so on. Now, these buses each have corresponding auxiliary tracks, which I'll title, and use the same color coding that I used for the tracks. So if the drums are blue, the drum bus will be blue, etc. This lets me adjust the level of individual tracks if needed, so if I just want more of the snare, I could affect that track. But if I want more or less of the overall drums, I could affect the drum bus's fader. Later on, this is also going to make it easy to collectively process an instrument group while still having control over the individual signals that make up that group. It also makes it easy to bounce out stems, which could be really useful if the track is going to be in a video, or you need to send tracks to various musicians for some review or practice. So before we begin to introduce any processing, let's take a listen to the song that we're working on. I'm going to be routing it as I detailed here and show how simple it is to quickly adjust some levels, solo instrument groups, and just generally navigate the session.
I'm heading downtown, running from the I had my phone.
At this point, we can start processing with high-pass filters. So next up, let's insert equalizers where they're needed. Before I add any additive processing or plugins that amplify anything, I'm going to ensure that my lows are taken care of. Now, high-pass filters are really simple, but they're really powerful as well, so here's what I'd recommend. Start with a 12 dB per octave slope and attenuate instruments that occupy the mid to high ranges. So typically guitars, some synths, vocals, and so on. Now the trick here is to avoid cutting higher than the signal's fundamental. The fundamental is usually represented as a high amplitude spike, and as the note changes, naturally the frequency will change as well. Now with something like a kick, you'll notice that the fundamental is static or just one note, unless you're working with an 808. But on a melodic instrument, the fundamental's frequency shifts with each note. So cut to right below the lowest note or the fundamental. This almost guarantees that all musical aspects are left intact, while unmusical sounds like rumble, plosives, hum, and so on get attenuated. Now the caveat to this comes with the lowest frequency instruments. For example, if the kick's fundamental is lower than about 70 Hz, a high-pass filter is likely going to do more harm than good. That said, it's always a good idea to use your ears and determine what's best. Now if you don't want to add these filters to all of the tracks, or if it takes up too much CPU, you could add them to the buses, but I think addressing it on an instrument-by-instrument basis is a little bit better. Now once we have everything cut up to the fundamental, it's a good idea to see if any of the fundamentals could be cut out as well. I almost never do this to super important instruments like the lead vocal, but it can help a lot if it's done on BGVs, maybe some doubled guitars, supporting instruments, and so on. This ensures that the lows are primarily occupied by the bass, the kick, and the vocal's lowest notes, resulting in a great foundation on which we can build a mix. Now, one thing to be mindful of when using these types of filters is how it can affect multi-tracked instruments, but we're going to cover that in more detail in a future chapter. For now, let's take a listen to our mix with these filters added and notice how it sounds cleaner, the lows sound more focused, and how it already feels like the instruments are competing less for space.
I'm heading downtown, running from the hills. I ended face down, looks like I had my phone.
Next up, we're going to equalize the kick and the bass. So let's revisit the equalizers that we used on the kick and the bass. Again, depending on their fundamental frequencies, we may or may not have to introduce a high-pass filter. Regardless, we could improve the relationship between our kick and bass with these EQs. Now I'm going to use this Pro Q3 that lets me easily find conflicting frequencies. So on the bass, I'll monitor the kick and see if and where the bass and the kick are overlapping too heavily. If they are, which happens more often than not, I'm going to use a bell filter on the bass and attenuate the frequency of the kick's fundamental. Since the bass guitar's fundamental changes frequency, it's a lot easier to attenuate the kick's fundamental on the bass than it is to attenuate the bass's multiple fundamental frequencies on the kick. Try not to make this cut too intense. It can become noticeable or take away from too much of the bass. It's best just to use your ears and vary the filter's amplitude until everything seems to fit right. Additionally, when you do this, be sure to listen to the kick and the bass in the context of the full mix. If you solo just the kick and the bass, you're not going to get a realistic idea of the sound. Instead of an EQ, you could also use a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor with the kick sidechained. Now this way the attenuation only occurs whenever the kick hits. I usually find that a static or a regular EQ is going to work just fine, but know that it's an option and it can improve the sound under the right conditions. So let's take a listen to this filter being added and notice how the kick and the bass sound a little more balanced and how the lows in general have a cleaner, more balanced sound.
I'm heading downtown, running from the hills. I ended face down, looks like I had my fill.
Next, I want to explain why you should be careful with multi-tracked instruments. So in Chapter 2, I briefly mentioned how high-pass filters can cause issues when you're working on a multi-tracked instrument. So let me briefly explain that. Now, without getting super in-depth about it, a high-pass filter alters the phase rotation of a track a good amount. Normally, this doesn't matter too much, but when it's combined with signals from the same instrument, it can cause some problems. For example, say I have a stereo track acoustic guitar. Now, both microphones are capturing the same performance, but with slight differences. If I was to use a high-pass filter on one of the two recorded signals, the phase rotation caused by the filter will likely cause destructive interference between the two recorded signals. Now to fix this, I'll either need to remove the filter or I'll need to use the same high-pass filter settings on the other track. It takes a good amount of detail to explain why this happens, so if you'd like a more in-depth explanation, we made a video called Fixing Phase, which covers everything that you need to know about phase relations. For now, let's take a listen to this example and notice how the acoustic guitar sounds worse when I use a high-pass filter on one and not the other recording. Next, I want to subtly gate, then compress the signal. So after my initial EQ has been introduced, it's time to use some gating and compression. Now typically, gating gets ignored or overlooked, but gating or downward expansion can be really useful, especially before any additive processing. Now if a signal has some unwanted noise, which is common with a bass or a guitar, gating could be used to attenuate the noise during quieter moments as well as add to the musicality and the rhythm. Now, if you time the gating right, you basically increase the dynamic range in a way that matches the timing of the instrument. For example, if I gate a bass guitar and time the downward expansion with the performance, it'll add to the percussive nature of the bass in turn, supporting the song's rhythm and natural cadence. Now, too aggressive of settings will cause a lack of clarity or an unnatural sound, so it's best to use a softer knee setting for gating and a smaller range, usually 6 dB, is a good starting point. Once signals have been gated, which doesn't need to happen for every signal, I'll start introducing something that I consider to be additive processing, peak down compression. Now, although peak down compression causes attenuation, the point is to control the peaks and then boost the signal afterward, in turn amplifying the quieter parts of the signal and increasing the detail of a track. If I was to use peak down compression and subsequent makeup gain as the first insert for a track, then some of the unmusical aspects that I attenuated with the various high-pass filters would be amplified. So that's why I usually save compression for later. How you compress and the settings that you use depend heavily on the timbre that you're trying to create. I typically go for an upfront sound with my compression, so I like to use a softer knee, a moderate ratio, and some automatic makeup gain. Now, if it's available, I'll also use some look ahead to capture the peak quickly, in turn, ensuring that quieter details of the transient are also captured and amplified. So let's take a listen to compression being introduced to various instruments. I'll use some smoother compression for the bass, maybe VCA or optical. Then I'll use FET compression on the kick with a quicker attack and release to add a little distortion to the kick's transients. Now for the vocal, I'll try some different types out until I find what gives it an enjoyable and upfront sound. So let's take a listen to gating and compression being introduced and notice how everything sounds more detailed, upfront, and louder.
I'm heading downtown, running from the hills. I ended face down, looks like I had my fill.
Next up, let's thoughtfully introduce some saturation. So saturation is usually thought of as a distinct form of processing, which it is, but it can be boiled down to mostly soft knee compression and harmonic distortion. Now, harmonics play the biggest role in the sound of saturation. They make a signal sound fuller due to psychoacoustics, but just as importantly, they equalize the signal by amplifying the frequencies occupied by the harmonics. Now, if we're trying to create a clean-sounding mix, it's crucial that we pick which harmonics are included and on what instruments, especially on low-frequency instruments. For example, say the kick is saturated and the saturation type adds a strong second-order harmonic. It's likely that this harmonic will amplify a frequency that heavily overlaps with the bass. So, similar to Chapter 3, we now have competition between our kick and our bass for some limited room. Depending on the frequencies the kick and the bass occupy, this may or may not be a problem, but it's important to consider nonetheless. All in all, it's best not to think of saturation just as something that only makes a signal fuller, but to also keep in mind that it can cause interference if the harmonics amplify already occupied frequencies. Now, one more thing to consider, I find that the saturation type that's used affects transients. For example, I find that tube saturation often increases the impact of transients, whereas tape often smooths them out. Now, with this in mind, it might be best to use a clean tube setting on the kick to emphasize transients, but to avoid clashing second-order harmonics, then to use tape on the bass to smooth it out. Of course, using your ears is always best to determine if a saturation type works well or if it doesn't, since each plugin and hardware unit is different.
I'm heading downtown, running from the hills. I ended face down, looks like I had my fill.
Last up, let's introduce creative and time-based processing. Now, at this point in the mix, the dynamics are controlled, the signals are a lot more balanced, and everything is starting to fit into place. Now is a great time to add creative and time-based processing, so delays, reverb, modulation, chorusing, and similar types of effects. It's a lot easier to get a good sound when we first control the signal and then add these types of processors than if we were to use them first. Now, if I want a particular instrument to have a specific sound, for example, if I want a bright and spacious sound for the snare, I could reverberate it individually on its track. If I want a collective sound for the instrument group, I could add the processor to the bus, maybe a room reverb that affects all the drums or a collective delay on the BGVs or something similar. Now, once you've created any temporal or creative effects that you want, I'd recommend using 1 to 2 additional processors on the buses. I usually find EQ, an exciter like the plug-in Fresh Air or a saturator, is what's needed to either create a bright and balanced sound or to create a collective sound, respectively. The temporal effects are going to create space and or a stylistic aspect, but in a way that retains the clarity of the track due to when we introduce them. Then, the last couple of processors give us the control that we need to make some last-minute adjustments. So let's take a listen to the mix. Now, before I show you the demo, I'm going to listen to it on my end and make any last-minute changes that are needed. Maybe I'll boost some at 2 kHz on a vocal or adjust the level of an instrument, and so on. Keep in mind that more will need to be done before I'd call this mix finished, but notice how what we've done has given us a clean sound on which we can make some more needed changes.
I'm heading downtown, running from the hills. I ended face down, looks like I had my fill. I'm heading downtown, running from the hills. I ended face down, looks like I had my fill.
Like I was saying at the beginning of the video, we have a new membership, and when you sign up, we'll master your first 10 songs for free. Additionally, every month, we'll master 2 additional songs for free. These 10 free mastered songs and 2 monthly free additional mastered songs will continuously accumulate in your account. They're not going to expire, so you could use them whenever you're ready, as long as you remain a member. Furthermore, you get access to the Sage Audio University, and currently, our School of Mastering course is available in its entirety. It's a 21-video, nearly 4-hour course that teaches mastering in depth from a technical, practical, and creative perspective. A complete School of Mixing course is going to be out next, which as a member, you'll get access to at no extra cost. The same free access goes for the many other courses that we have planned for in the future. Now, members can access our SAU community, where you can introduce yourself, ask questions, share insights and experiences, and connect with like-minded and passionate artists and engineers. To further strengthen this community, we created the SAU Mix Review community. Here you could post your mixes and get feedback from us and your fellow producers and engineers. Now, so far, we've already heard a lot of fantastic mixes and seen firsthand how helpful and insightful this community can be. Last up, you get some great free perks like 51 mixing and mastering chain templates, 20 unmixed multi-track sessions from various artists spanning multiple genres that you could use for mixing practice, 42 finished mixes for mastering practice, and 39 plugin presets created by our engineers. All of this is available to you for a low monthly cost. And if you sign up for the membership today, you'll receive a custom 70% discount, which brings the total monthly membership cost down to $15. And this discount is locked in, so you'll continue to receive it for as long as you're a member. So if you're interested, you can use the link below to sign up with a 70% discount. Thank you so much for watching the video.